Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Weekend Review for Sunday, November 15, 2020. In this episode, we continue to discuss the various topics around the war in Artsakh. We'll be talking to our guests about the following major topics. The war ends, what are the terms of the deal? Pax Russiana, the extent of Turkey's presence in Azerbaijan, Jubilation in Baku, and more. To talk about these issues, we have with us Asbed Kotchikian, a senior lecturer of political science and international relations at Bentley University in Massachusetts, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and former Soviet space. Emil Sanamyan, a senior research fellow at USC's Institute of Armenian Studies, specializing in politics in the Caucasus with a special focus on Azerbaijan, and Artyom Tonoyan, who is a research associate at the University of Minnesota Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies with specialties in religion and politics and nationalism in the South Caucasus and Russia. Hello and welcome, everyone.
Hello, Asbed.
Hello, Asbed.
36 hours after we recorded last week's podcast, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia signed a joint statement to end the war. Under the terms of the Russian-brokered deal, by December, Armenian forces are to withdraw from 3 districts, Karvajar, Lachin, and Aghdam, while Azerbaijan will keep the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding areas captured during the conflict. What is your overall thought about the document that was signed?
Yeah, the document is not to end the war. It's a document on ceasefire. Of course, it's a document that has all the hallmarks of surrender because it calls for surrender of additional territories, Karvajar, Berdzor, and Aghdam. So, what to think? This is probably the worst defeat in modern Armenian history. I don't think anything compares to it since period of end of World War I, and it brings about a lot of uncertainty as far as the future of Armenia. I wouldn't even call it uncertainty, but certainty that future is not going to be great. Many people are thinking of this as the defeat in Artsakh. And what is this defeat in Artsakh? Up until now, since Armenia's independence, Artsakh was the only part of Armenian homeland that the Armenians themselves acquired and maintained and controlled and secured with their own army, in spite of pressures from Russia and all the other international players to abandon it. So now it has been abandoned, and Armenia no longer controls any part of its own homeland by itself. That function has been transferred to the Russian government. And what does that mean? That means that Armenia is no longer an independent player as a factor in this region. It is becoming subsumed by Russia.
Artyom?
Thanks for having me for the program. And as far as the war in this iteration has stopped, and as far as the killings have stopped, the carnage has stopped, I guess we can say there's something positive to be found in this document. But overall, I don't see anything positive coming out of it. As Emil said, this is probably the worst defeat in modern Armenian history, probably since 1920 Kars agreement.
Asbed Kotchikian, what are your thoughts about this document?
Obviously, this is a document that it's an accelerated version of what has been in the making for decades in terms of the return of land, occupied territories to Azerbaijan and so on, but it goes much beyond that in terms of capitulations, if you want to call it, as it's been referred to. It does establish Russian presence there. I have looked at the document in detail, except for the dates, and there are a couple of things that the language is obviously not clear or can be left for interpretation. But in terms of Armenia's presence or Armenia's willingness and sovereignty to be able to negotiate a deal on its own has been taken away from it. This reminds me of a conference many years ago that took place in University of Michigan in Ann Arbor about Armenian international treaties. And at the time, I edited a special issue of the Armenian Review for this. And it's fascinating that throughout history, Armenians have usually been absent from any agreements, any treaties that actually sealed their fate. So this is in continuation of that tradition, let's call it.
One thing, obviously, this was a document that was forced upon Armenia, but it does have Armenia's signature on it, Armenian Prime Minister's signature. And another factor here, I think that, I'm not sure how it correlates with the agreements between 1918 and 1920, here is that this agreement quickly evolved, obviously, with the events on the ground, over a month period, basically as early as early October, a month before this agreement was announced. This document or something similar, but not as bad because Armenian forces controlled more territory, was presented to the Armenian government, and the Armenian government decided not to sign it at the time, decided to fight, publicly declared its intention to fight, at the same time did not mobilize resources, did not conduct a mobilization in any substantial way, and allowed for this defeat to worsen over the next 4 weeks. before signing the agreement. I'm not sure how that correlates with Kars' situation. I'm sure at the time, the information in terms of decision making was even less available in terms of number of forces the Turkish government could bring to bear against Kars. In this case, I think that information was available from day one. It was clear that Turkey was directly involved in fighting. It was clear that precedents that were created by Turkey in Syria and elsewhere, Libya, basically left Armenian armed forces with no chance of effectively countering them. So that was all clear from the beginning. Still, the decisions were taken that were taken. So this agreement is as much a reflection of things on the ground as it is a reflection of Armenian decision-making process. So Armenia is definitely in this agreement.
Last week we talked a little bit about this question when I was saying about the Armenian army's engagement in this. Was the Armenian army engaged in support of Karabakh at the same level, for example, that Turkey was engaged with Azerbaijan?
No, we cannot compare those two things in the sense that Armenian army includes the defense army of Nagorno-Karabakh, included and continues to include. That's the Armenian armed forces. Հայկական ուժեր, հայկական բանակ. It includes Pashpanutyan Banak, which is the defense army. It includes 5 other corps from 1st to 5th that are based in a proper Armenian territory. And there are some also centralized units. Now, every single unit had participated in this fighting to one extent or another. That's the extent that matters. Mm-hmm. And we discussed this, that the decision by the Armenian government not to escalate on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border proper to be able to relieve pressure from Artsakh basically made this military situation unwinnable for the Armenian side. But yes, each major unit of Armenian army had participated in some way or another in the fighting. Some of them did better than others, but there's no way to say that the Armenian army was not involved in this fighting. Of course it was involved. Armenian army is the defense army of Nagorno-Karabakh. That's what it is.
We heard reports that, for example, 3 jeeps came to take Zankilan with absolutely no opposition.
Yeah, because everybody ran away before that. There was no fighting for it. The key turning point happened on October 7. As you might recall, Nikol Pashinyan came to Karabakh at the time, and then in his public interview announced that, we're about to defeat Azerbaijan, we're on a counteroffensive right now. Of course, the counteroffensive failed miserably. By October 8, that was clear. And this counteroffensive was taking place in Jabrail district, south or around Jabrail in that area. And the reason it failed, because the Armenian units involved in it basically were attacked again at a distance by the drones, and they had no ability to really push the opponent out from that. And this was still when the easement that the Turkish Azerbaijani forces won was only limited to a very narrow passageway along the axis. So that's where they broke through, and then they started to widen that area towards the north and also move towards the Republic of Armenia border. And as they moved towards the Republic of Armenia border, basically there was not much opposition. There was another attempt to counterattack between Berdzor and Kubatli in that area, and that was basically it. The army was routed and fled.
Okay, Artyom, your thoughts about this document?
Yeah, in as far as the killing has stopped, the carnage has stopped, the unnecessary deaths have stopped. There's, I guess, something positive to be said about this document. But other than that, this is a very infelicitous document for Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and for Armenian Republic. And this has become probably the, as Emil said, the heaviest Armenian defeat in the last 100 years. To be honest, it also reflects the real balance of power in the region. Russia and Azerbaijan and Turkey were able to impose a will of sorts, a peace of sorts on Armenia, not on Armenia's terms. And what does that say about Armenia's ability to counteract this will? Well, we see that Armenia fought in places valiantly, but was unable to counter this document or the realities on the ground. So it was imposed on Armenia, and I guess we will have to deal with this, we will have to live with this. And as I said again, it is a reflection of the existing balance of power, and from which we honestly probably had no chance of escape, given the circumstances, given the political situation in the country, given the logistical nightmare that reigned supreme in the Armenian army in terms of being able to move materiel and personnel to the front lines, the complete breakdown of coordination, and so on and so forth, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, and there is no point in making making further claims about it. But again, yeah, this is a...
Artyom, we have heard reports that there were multiple proposals offered to Prime Minister Pashinyan all along the war, right? We heard that there were nearly 10 proposals. Each one got worse as time progressed, but each one was essentially rejected. And at the same time, the previous one was preferred.
Yes, right now we don't know the full extent of all these proposals that were proposed. I haven't seen any concrete proof or evidence speaking about this. I mean, there are some insinuations here and there, but we are yet to see any concrete documents or anything that offers something that we can say, yes, now we see that this proposal was made and Pashinyan had rejected. But having said that, it is not completely out of character for Pashinyan or his government to have rejected these proposals. It is sort of a reflection of his political shtick and his political modus operandi to not back down in the face of threat. And I guess this is what we have to deal with, the aftermath of it all.
Yeah, my insinuation is actually about not having any options, but that was at the end that we didn't have any options. There were multiple opportunities for us to say things are not going well and let's exit this much earlier in the game than on the 44th day.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, anybody worth his or her salt who saw how the military developments were taking place, and anybody that was not just being engaged with Armenian statements on the progress of war through Shushan Hayrapetyan and through Artyom Tonoyan, and if you could, as I did, read alternative sources of information, Azeri sources, Russian sources, and having talked to some colleagues here in the United States, I mean, you could tell that the situation was not going to improve anytime soon, if ever. I also heard that there were proposals made to Pashinyan to stop the war at a certain point, but he chose not to do it. God knows only why. But yes, it is only reasonable to assume that these proposals were made and these proposals were handily rejected.
Another point I wanted to make is that the push to stop the war primarily was coming from Karabakh itself as well. Because obviously being on the ground, they recognized the extent to which Turkish Air Force had decimated the Armenian forces there. And basically by October 20th, the leadership of Nagorno-Karabakh pushed Nikol to accept the proposal. This is still before loss of Shushi, of course, and loss of Ivan Kubatli. But he actually, sent a delegation there to press Nagorno-Karabakh not to say these things publicly and suck up the situation. Yeah, I mean, it's a major, like I already mentioned the other time, major miscalculation, colossal miscalculation, colossal failure by Nikol Pashinyan.
Yeah.
In the sense that he was given cover by Nagorno-Karabakh, by Artsakh government, to exit this and to exit it in a way that they would give him cover, saying that we agree to this. This is not being done against our will. Yeah, I guess his thinking was that this was another revolution, and all you have to do is just push a little bit, and things will change. It's a different type of framework he was operating in.
And I also read that already October 10, Russia had been talking to Pashinyan and Aliyev about the Russian peacekeepers as early as October 10, which already says a lot about the way things were developing. Russia, I guess, was offering a way out for Armenia in this. But as far as I know, Pashinyan was not all that warm to the idea of having Russian peacekeepers as early as then.
Well, one of the things here is that the issue of the fog of war and the decision-making as well as communication has been one of the major issues. I'm not talking about communication vis-a-vis the public, as was mentioned by official statements made by both Karabakh and Armenia, but also communication and information that has been passed on to the decision makers, in this case Pashinyan. Again, a lot of things to be told. There are so many factors, so many actors, so many voices as to what really happened, at what point it was decided. We can only look at implications, we can only look at trends rather than try to prepare a composite image of what was happening. The question remains, and it is a highly questionable question, let's put it that way, whether or not was Pashinyan aware of the gravity of the situation, or was it was the mentality of just keep pushing and pushing. Were the commanders on the ground or the defense ministry and so on, were they informing him as to how dire the situation was? I'm sure they have. I'm sure they did. But again, I think it's a multitude of things. And as what Artyom mentioned, it is true. It was on October 10th. That was you wouldn't have a marathon meeting without actually having something to discuss and having so little to announce afterwards. So
yeah, and I guess I have to come back to what Emil was saying last week. Lack of leadership, and I'll add lack of experience with a situation like this. There's not enough time to actually look at every point in this document. We're not going to do that. Let me pick something that stuck to me and ask you. Asbed, in point 9 it says, all economic activity and transport links in the region are to be restricted. The Republic of Armenia guarantees the safety of transport links between western regions of the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Nakhichevan Autonomous Republic in order to organize unimpeded movement of citizens, vehicles, cargo in both directions. What do you make of this? What does all economic activity mean, do you think?
Yeah, one of the things, just a minor correction, you said region are to be restricted. It's actually be unrestricted.
Unrestricted, I'm sorry.
Yes, it includes a multitude of things. The basic example in terms of history, something that I have studied, not closely, unfortunately, but I have studied, is how different countries have corridor links via the land or the territory of other countries. The closest example in terms of, or the clearest example that could be analyzed, and again, context matters, is the issue of West Berlin and its connection with West Germany back during the Cold War. We're talking about 100 miles, about 160 kilometers of disconnect, or West Berlin being far from it. And at the time, they had a very narrow rail and highway corridor connecting West Germany with West Berlin. So if we were to look at that, if that's going to be a model, quote unquote, the question would be then, would there be restrictions? Would they be able to transport military equipment or not? That's very vague, although they don't mention specifically this, but they do add as well in that point that the Russian border services would actually supervise and basically control that. Actually, that's what it says. Transport control is carried out by the bodies of the border service of Russia. It is definitely a last moment addition, I think. And I'm sure if we were to get the previous documents, we would see that probably this ninth point might not have been there, at least not until October 10th, probably. And by November, Armenian position was so weak that this was, I think, imposed on them. But it is major success for Aliyev to be able to impose that and pass it on. Now, again, the devil is in details. We don't know what it would mean, but it has at the end, it's also in the same point, it says by agreement of the parties, the construction, which probably also includes Russia, because it says the parties, the construction of the infrastructure is to take place down the line. And I'm guessing that would be railway and a narrow corridor of land and any other manifestation of that.
So this notion of unimpeded access between Nakhchivan and the rest of Azerbaijan was always connected to unimpeded access between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh via Lachin corridor. Another key element here is that there was a last moment evolution of the document, in that earlier version demanded the return of Azerbaijani enclaves in Tavush, some of them very close to the Yerevan-Tbilisi highway. And as part of that, the Lachin corridor would have remained under Armenian control, including Berdzor, would have remained under Armenian control. But at the last moment, the Armenian government, I presume, preferred giving up Berdzor and not giving up those couple of enclaves along that road. So the reference to the Gazakh district enclaves was removed, and it was not a very clear, which exact areas would have been returning to Azerbaijani control. There's this Askipara enclave there, a ruined village there, and a couple others next to it. So that would have meant basically, within a kilometer progress by Azerbaijani forces in that area. Instead, the Armenian government preferred to give up the Lachin corridor to Russian control and keep those enclaves there.
When you say the Armenian government, do you know who exactly was negotiating these agreements?
Nikol Pashinyan and Zorab Nakhchivan, nobody else, as far as I know.
When you say the village 1 kilometer inside Armenia, that is basically an Azeri enclave, is that really worth anything strategically, or was it basically a bargaining chip for Azerbaijan?
No, it does sit on the old highway. There's been a bypass built around there as well, but certainly the Armenian government has prioritized Republic of Armenia over Artsakh in this entire war, in terms of not involving more of Republic of Armenia territory into the fighting, and basically keeping some of the forces that could have been engaged back. And also at the end, they prefer to give up a substantially larger territory, which would be a Lachin corridor, which would be about 100 square kilometers, for a much smaller territory, which is in the northeast of Armenia.
As I was following about the enclaves, which were the remnant of Soviet maps, I didn't see any reliable source about this other than chatter, and it might have been also pushed forward by the Azerbaijani side just to maximize their demands, but it wasn't publicly, that is, but not formally. So from that perspective, I'm not again sure if it was actually discussed or it was just a publicity stunt by the Azerbaijani side. And again, if you look at the previous documents and so on, Azerbaijan has mentioned once in a while about having access to Nakhichevan, but at least the documents before the war, or any kind of an agreement that would have been before the war, that access corridor or access to Nakhichevan was not discussed. Of course, the most notorious one being the Gobel plan back in the 90s, building a bridge and so on, for which at the time President Kotchikian was sort of amiable, but not completely sold.
The Gaza agreement was on the Kremlin website, and then they updated it, removed reference to the Gaza district, and edited the part where Armenia was keeping Lachin corridor to Armenia handing the Lachin corridor to the Russian forces.
Putin's nuanced political navigation throughout the Artsakh war may be paying off. Last week I had mentioned that they are on their back feet because of this whole affair, but it looks like Russia appears to have outmaneuvered Turkey as the sole non-warring signatory in the ceasefire document, and says it will be the only power to send peacekeeping troops to the region, although Turkey and Azerbaijan are now arguing this point. Well, at least for now, Russia seems to have expanded its presence in Armenia and now also in Azerbaijan. Emil, what are your thoughts about this?
Russia is in a very weak position right now because it hasn't demonstrated its ability to bring its force to bear on either Azerbaijan or Turkey. We can see that, the helicopter situation, etc. They're still building up their contingent in Karabakh. There might be also a buildup of a Russian contingent inside Armenia proper. We'll see exactly where it goes, but at this point, this situation reminds me of the Kosovo situation, where after basically being opposed to NATO bombing of Yugoslavia and support for Kosovo independence, at the very last moment, Russian peacekeeping contingent, which was based in Bosnia as per Dayton agreements, made a sort of a dash towards Pristina and took control of the Pristina airport. Of course, Kosovo was seen from a Russian perspective as part of Serbia, so they were acting in coordination with the Serbian government. And that's a very important point that I think maybe have neglected. The Russian government made it clear that it would not get involved in Karabakh unless it has Azerbaijan's okay. So now they have Azerbaijan's okay, and in the future they might potentially expand their footprint in the region and act more vigorously, but so far, they are acting in a fairly low-key manner, even with this peacekeeping intention.
What is their ultimate goal in the region by having these boots on the ground, Asbed?
That was the plan all together. I mean, it's going back to the 1990s to have the goal is to have boots on the ground to be able to better influence or stronger leverages on both sides. And this was repeatedly refused by both Armenia and Azerbaijan for the longest time. Even when there were direct negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, one of the motivations was to exclude Russia or Russian return to the region. So from that perspective, I think Russian wait and see policy did pay off. That was interpreted by many as being Russia was caught off guard, that Russia cannot handle its own backyard, and so on and so forth. But Russia, without, as you mentioned, as the only non-warring signatory and presence in the region now, and consolidating that. As Emil mentioned, that Azerbaijan also agreed to this. So technically speaking, Russian troops have to get Azerbaijani approval to have troops on their territory from their perspective, but that could easily change. It's such a fluid stand that Azerbaijan might say, thank you guys, you did your job, now you can go back.
Well, so Russia already has the base in Gyumri. What is the additional benefit that they are going to get by having a checkpoint controlling all the goods that flow between Nakhichevan and Armenia, and of course also between Iran and Armenia?
First of all, I don't think there will be disconnect between Iran and Armenia. That from that perspective, Russia does not have a mandate to control. It's about protecting the border, but they do not have mandate to stop what comes to the country or what goes out, be that from airport or land border. Now that being said, the added value of them controlling the potential corridor, let's call it, would be the fact that they actually can allow or turn a blind eye or actually impose more strict regulations as to the transport of military. While it doesn't say so explicitly, but that is one of the other things. Just like they can control military or any kind of an access that goes from Armenia to Karabakh, to the Lachin corridor.
Artyom, can you comment a little bit on the issues of sovereignty exposed by these points in the document?
Sure. What I was going to say that Russian foreign policy has moved well away from battering with a shoe on the table to putting down its fist on the table. So this is, in a sense, Russia's imposition of its will on the region in a much more forceful way than previously. So since 2012, Russia's unceremonious departure from Azerbaijan, from Kabbalah, I think some members of the Russian foreign policy establishment and the military establishment would have wanted to have come back to the region, to Azerbaijan in particular. It is a much more appealing fruit, let's put it this way, than Armenia, which they have effectively sewn up. In terms of why would Russia want to do this and why is it so interested in the region, I think when you have the chance, you have to take it. And for Russian foreign policy and military calculus, this is the best chance for them to reintegrate the region in a much more beneficial, as they understand, much more beneficial way, and to keep a tab and to be able to monitor the situation and, if needs be, to introduce certain actions that may or may not be beneficial to the regional players, but it's certainly in its mind or in the foreign policy establishment type's mind, it would be beneficial for Russia's strategic goals for the region. And this is a way of Russia to be able to impose a certain form of conflict management that is much more forceful and much more predictable as far as they are concerned.
From a regional power perspective, is the goal to basically keep Iran and Turkey out? Because it doesn't look like Turkey is out of the region. Turkey seems to be deeply entrenched in Azerbaijan. Emil?
Well, yeah, I mean, they can only keep it out to a particular extent. It's clear that there is huge support for alliance with Turkey and Azerbaijan. They look at Turkey as much more favorable ally than Russia on a public level. The only thing that stands in between complete annexation of Azerbaijan by Turkey, from Russia's perspective, is the Aliyev regime, which is more tied to the sort of the ex-Soviet power elite. So they are playing this kind of balancing game, propping up Aliyev with this conflict, basically. The extent to which they can limit Turkish influence, they will try to do it. The extent to which they can't limit, they will fail. One thing is clear that in the period of the early 90s, after the end of the First Karabakh War and the other conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the unraveling of Russian influence continued, even though Russians managed to introduce their peacekeepers in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and not in Karabakh, but the unraveling continued. The unraveling had the effect of the war in Chechnya, which of course continued with interruption for close to 10 years, and there was a major setback for Russia in many ways. So repetition of something like this today, when Russian predominance in the Caucasus has been questioned by Turkey, is very real, and the Russian government will have to think of ways to demonstrate its power. Just like Turkey looked for ways to demonstrate its power after Russians saved the Assad regime and came in and started shooting everywhere there, they looked for ways to restrain and constrain Russian power there. So Russians will have to find a way to respond in kind as long as the decision-making works. All of these regimes, Turkey, Russia, are inherently fragile regimes because they're one-man regimes. A lot depends on a particular state of mind and particular condition of their leaders, and both leaders have their frailties. They're advancing in age. The situation will remain unpredictable. For now, it seems that Armenia is moving towards sort of the Abkhazization of its status, in the sense that Armenia is a recognized state, but it depends fully on Russian security arrangements. It doesn't have its own army anymore that's capable of defending itself, and essentially becomes an appendage of Russia. Of course, with the consequences for the political system in Armenia and the social system and all the other multiple consequences that are there. If we look at what happened in Abkhazia in the last 12 years, since 2008, since Russia recognized Abkhazia and formalized its presence there, not much has happened in terms of positive economic development, but I can't say things have gotten a lot worse either. We can think of freezing this situation, but of course, I think after this defeat and after this displacement that has occurred, there's going to be a resumption of major immigration from Armenia as soon as there is an opportunity to do that.
In your question, you also mentioned about Iran. I don't think Russia views Iran as a challenger. Iran's foreign policy towards the South Caucasus, going back to the last days of the Soviet Union, has always been one of accepting Russia's supremacy or Russia's role.
Or rather, almost complementary in a sense.
Beyond complementary, it is. But at the same time, Russia would accept that Iran does have some interest in the region and wouldn't block them. I remember in 1989, the Iranian president at the time, Rafsanjani, visited Moscow Moscow on his way back made a stop in Baku. And it was very similar to the trip that George Bush Sr. actually had made to Ukraine around the same time, where the message that they were sending was basically do not call, do not ask for independence, do not break down the Soviet Union. That's a completely different discussion as to why they were doing that. But Rafsanjani or Iran in the last 30 years or so, the Islamic Republic has actually navigated a very, very cautious, but also it established itself that people, especially at least Turkey and Russia, would consider Iran's moods, if you want to call it. That's another story that, the whole negotiations, which was in a Euro-Atlantic framework, with Russia, with the United States and France in it, they vetoed any, especially the United States, any Iranian presence. But Iran is not viewed by Russia, has never been viewed by Russia, at least in its backyard, as a major
Right,
challenger.
it's not a very adversarial relationship. Asbed, one question Emil was talking about Abkhazia, it got me thinking. What is Georgia's role? They seem to be almost like an innocent bystander in the region right now.
Yeah, well, the Georgian president, after the agreement was signed, she sent a tweet, or I think it was a statement that we welcome this historic day. We congratulate both sides and so on, which was actually criticized by many people I talked with in Georgia as to like what is there to congratulate, obviously. But they are also caught between the rock and the hard place, right? I mean, the Russian border is closed with Georgia for economic activities and so on. And it's fascinating for anyone who's been to the border. I have been there about a year ago or so. You would look at all the transport that goes from Georgia to Russia are actually all Armenian trucks, trucks with Armenian license plates. There's that need to stay uninvolved, but at the same time, it's a very difficult situation that they have. And we know during the war, a lot of comments were made that Georgia is allowing the transport of military equipment from Turkey to Azerbaijan. It's allowing its airspace to be used and so on and so forth. So Georgia is not it's not the happiest place when it comes to Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. On the one hand, it definitely has to respect the concept of territorial integrity because of its own problem with the South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And on the other hand, you have the issue of at least not to antagonize Armenia enough that they might not benefit from anything that there might be from
And
Armenia.
similarly, I think maybe the encroachment on the part of Turkey and Ajaria, they have a lot of problems.
Right, we can have a whole discussion on that. But one of the things that people do not realize that when many pundits talk about, oh, the Muslims in Ajaria, first of all, they're Georgians, not Muslims. Georgian identity is very much based on language. So even when it comes to the Svans or the Mingrelians and so on, what unifies them is language. That's a core identity of Georgian. Even though there are a lot of investments in Turkish investment and Azerbaijani investments in Ajaria, in Batumi specifically. I think they do not necessarily look at that as an opportunity, or even the Muslim Georgians, as an attempt by Turkey to become their big brother and to destabilize probably Georgia within.
I think the main unifying factor in Georgia is Georgian church and Georgian citizenship rather than language. If we look at the Mingrelians, they do speak a different language related to Georgian, but they are part of the Georgian Orthodox Church, they're part of the Georgian state. In terms of Ajarians, what happened over the Soviet period is, of course, a secularization of the entire population, but also a substantial Christianization of what used to be Muslim Georgians. So at this point, Batumi is overwhelmingly Christian Georgian rather than Muslim Georgian, and the only Muslim Georgian communities that are there are, in very remote areas of mountainous part of Ajaria. So that is an important factor. Returning to Salome Zurabashvili, she's perceived very much like Armen Sargsyan in Armenia, and that's her status, irrelevant basically politically, just making statements and taking pictures every once in a while. One thing that Georgia did do is that they opened air corridor to the Russian military to deploy into Armenia and into Karabakh.
Was that closed during the conflict,
Quite a bit. During the conflict and before, for many, many years, Georgia's airspace is closed to Russian military traffic. Exceptions were made maybe once in a while, but not for, reinforcing the Russian base in Armenia or something like that. So all of that traffic, Russian military traffic that was coming into Armenia over many, many years now, had to go around. As a matter of fact, every once in a while, Russian military traffic would go over Azerbaijan and into Armenia, and Azerbaijan would allow reinforcement of the Russian base, but not Georgia. And they made an exception in this case, which made it possible for the deployment of Russian peacekeepers into Karabakh to proceed at the rapid pace as it did.
Well, I'm going to move on to a slightly more quote-unquote cultural topic. There's been a lot of jubilation in Baku recently. No doubt that Ilham Aliyev is the biggest personal winner from this war. By liberating the regions around Nagorno-Karabakh and imposing very harsh conditions on Armenia, he managed to not only deliver on his decades-long promise, but probably consolidating his dynastic rule for the foreseeable future. But at the same time, there have been reports over the past couple of weeks about the level of presence of the Turkish command and control in the Azerbaijani armed forces. I've been wondering how much of a sovereignty issue this presents for Azerbaijan.
Certainly, Erdogan delivered this victory for Azerbaijan. There's no doubt about it. What he's going to ask in return, I can speculate, but this was not a free service that they delivered. As we mentioned before, deployment of Turkish Air Force, the deployment of Turkish mercenaries, other considerable military support was basically underwritten by Azerbaijan, by Aliyev. So they paid Erdogan's son-in-law for the drones, to use the drones. They may have picked up even financial expenses for the operators of drones, the Turkish officers who operated them. Of course, the housing and all of that for Turkish military was also underwritten by Azerbaijan. The movement of mercenaries was done through Aliyev's airlines, Silkway Airlines. For the past number of years, Aliyev has invested a lot of money in Turkey. If you look at the investment balance, actually, Azerbaijan invested in Turkey roughly 3 or 4 times more than Turkey had invested in Azerbaijan over this 30 or whatever years. So there is this transactional aspect of this relationship where Turkish forces essentially acted as mercenaries for Azerbaijan, but the political significance is there. It was clear even before the war. There was an interesting incident that happened near the front line in, I think, Agdam district, where just shortly before the war, locals started to install Turkish flags at the official buildings and other public venues. And there was some misunderstanding with the local police, and they tried to take the flags off, and then they received the order from Baku to put up Turkish flags everywhere, and they did. There is, at the level of that segment of Azerbaijani population that is highly tired of Aliyev regime and the sort of the distribution of wealth, the way it occurs at the local level and everywhere else in Azerbaijan. They're looking at this increased Erdogan influence as an opportunity to maybe right some of the many wrongs. But I'm not seeing that having immediate repercussions for Aliyev. I think he's fairly skillful at balancing Erdogan and Putin, has been so far.
Emil, would you consider this the beginning of NATOization of Azerbaijani army?
There's no such thing as NATOization to start with. I mean, there are some efforts to integrate different militaries within NATO, but I mean, NATO is very different in its composition. And today especially, Turkey is certainly a model of its own. There's been an effort to Turkify the Azerbaijani army, no doubt about it. Most of the current officer corps of Azerbaijan had some training in Turkey. Many of them have gone universities in Turkey, etc., military universities, etc. But this is about Turkey. It's not about NATO. Turkey is acting as an independent actor and using NATO as a cover when it's useful for it to deal with Russia. Beyond that, they're an independent actor. NATO is largely irrelevant in terms of as a unified
I meant
bloc.
that more
It's
from
not
a
unified
weaponization perspective, for example, modernization and changing of...
Modernization. Yeah, modernization has, of course, followed multiple lines. If we look at the balance of purchases, Russian and Israeli weapons still predominate in Azerbaijan over Turkish weapons. Israeli weapons are primarily modernizations of Russian weaponry that they've done, in addition to more high-tech things that they have sold them, the drones. And
I think there is one point here that relates to this. The fifth point, if I'm not mistaken, of the agreement deals with the issue of establishing a peacekeeping command post. And there have been a lot of chatter about this on Azerbaijani side, that there are Turkish peacekeepers on the ground as well, which has been rejected or were basically dismissed by Russia. But there have been reports that the command post itself, the peacekeeping command post, Turkish military will be included in the command post in terms of observing.
That's right. I think it was mentioned that it was a joint command post.
That's right, yeah. And
Right.
there is a separate agreement been reached between Russia and Turkey, without Azerbaijan, I guess, that there would be this joint
So Armenia is not
observation.
the only one that actually other countries are
Yeah.
forcing it to sign
Yeah,
agreements and they are excluded from the process.
Well, I mean, Azerbaijanis are happy about that Turkish presence, much more than Armenians Armenians are happy about the Russian military presence.
Yeah,
so
I
far,
think
so.
wasn't it yesterday or the day before that the Turkish parliament passed some provision allowing the Turkish troops to be deployed there, but the Russians are essentially trying to counter that and trying to have a monitoring capability without boots on the ground. How it's going to take place is anyone's guess.
Okay, Artyom, I wanted to get your thoughts on the cultural aspect of this. We're not going to have time to go to the political scene in Yerevan, at least not today. Baku has been in a very festive mood of jubilation, and some of the effects have gone all the way to Shushi in the form of graffiti on Ghazan Chechot's. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
This was not unexpected, right? When this is a repeat behavior in terms of the church buildings suffering vandalism and so on and so forth. It's not very original to this timeline. I mean, this has happened before, and I guarantee this will happen in the future as well. But yes, the jubilation is there, and it is understandable. Although there are some rumblings of discomfort, if you will, among the Azeris, if you look at the social media and even some independent journalists and some independent thinking, I guess, exiles in the Azerbaijani diaspora, they're not altogether happy about how this came about and how it ended. The jubilation is there, but there is also a certain disappointment why Azerbaijan stopped and didn't go all the way and took over Stepanakert. But as far as the cultural aspects of this, the Armenian culture in the region, the Armenian churches, the Armenian cultural heritage in the region are absolutely in danger of being erased. Although yesterday Vladimir Putin came out and said that he has passed a message to Ilham Aliyev, or even directly appealed to Ilham Aliyev on the phone to take care of Armenian cultural monuments, churches, and so on and so forth. I mean,
And Artyom,
really,
the note also said that Aliyev responded that he was receptive to the idea.
Yeah, Aliyev can say one thing and do another. I mean, it is not incongruent with the behavior of dictators. They can speak from both ends of their mouth rather skillfully, and there are, millions of examples of this that we can talk about.
And Artyom,
Yeah,
excuse me for interruption, but it's not just about destruction, it's about reappropriation, right? This is something that has been
exactly.
going on from Soviet times about Caucasian Albanians as the Azeris being the descendants of Albanians and so on. So
Absolutely.
there were some attempts, or again, these days you can never verify, it's so difficult to verify, but then the Azeri cultural minister, I think,
Yeah, Deputy
ended up
Minister of
saying that this is
Culture.
an Albanian.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was mentioned. Again, I do not have a definitive proof that they did it or not, but yeah.
Well, this was referred to Dadivank specifically, and there was the Deputy Minister of Culture that came out and said this was an Albanian church and the apogee of Albanian architectural thought or something of the sort, and that they are going to take very good care of it, and they're going to make sure that everybody knows the true history of the church and the monastery complex. So the appropriation and reappropriation of Armenian cultural heritage is something to watch out for, and as pessimistic as it may sound, it is as realistic as it gets that these things are going to happen, and it is not going to just concern about putting up a sign that says that this is Azerbaijani cultural heritage, but they are going to make sure that Armenian traces on these buildings are removed. And I'm not going to say they are going to be replaced with some forgeries, but the proofs of the Armenian existence, they are absolutely going to be removed. And I don't even have any doubt about it. Other aspects of it, as recently as earlier this year, this has not been discussed actually. There was, I think, as far as I remember, a creation of an official Udi church that is looking to get, I guess, sanction or license from either the Turkish Orthodox Church, there is such a thing actually, believe it or not, or from the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Istanbul, trying to get an official autocephalous Udi church going. And this was done, this was very much under the radar, but there was an MOU signed, there is a charter that has been put forward, a constitution of sorts for this church. And I think this was a plan in place in terms of when these churches come under Azerbaijani control, you will have now Udi diocese of sorts, Udis being the descendants of the Albanians. There will be a ready clergy and a diocese that would take over these churches and reappropriate them and Albanize them and completely culturally, religiously, spiritually remove these churches from under Armenian jurisdiction.
Well, that is a down note, and there's so much more to talk about, but that's all the time we have today, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, Asbed.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Asbed.
And that concludes our program for this episode of Groong Week in Review. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from this previous week. We look forward to your feedback and suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's Groong, and on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm Hovik Manucharyan, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next week.